Welcome back to This Is a Commander channel, where this is a Commander channel, and today I'm going to be talking about Commander Tough Rules and Cool Interactions, episode 98. Today's episode is going to take a look at one of the new cards that was just recently spoiled from the Jurassic World Collection, and a neat way that you can get some extra value from it that you may not know about. The card is Indominus Rex Alpha, and it says, as Indominus Rex Alpha enters the battlefield, discard any number of creature cards. It enters with a flying counter on it if a card discarded this way has flying. The same is true for First Strike, Double Strike, Death Touch, Hexproof, Haste, Indestructible, Lifelink, Menace, Reach, Trample, and Vigilance. And then it also has a triggered ability that says, when Indominus Rex enters the battlefield, draw a card for each counter on it. So, some cool things about this before we get to the real star of this episode. Its first ability that grants it these ability counters is not a triggered ability, but is a replacement effect for how it enters the battlefield. Which means if your opponent's hoping to terminate this guy after it hits the battlefield, and then responding to the trigger letting you discard a creature with Indestructible, then that will not work, as there is no point at which this guy, this dino, will be on the battlefield and not have that Indestructible counter. Another neat thing is that his triggered ability to draw you the cards doesn't care about the kinds of counters on it. So if you're running something like the Great Hinge, then you can choose to order these ETBs in a way that he gets the +1/+1 counter from the hinge, and then you resolve the draw for number of cards. Or you could run something like Arwen, Weaver of Hope, that adds another replacement effect for how your creatures enter the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on them, and this will also increase your cards drawn. The amount of cards you draw is purely based on the number of counters and not limited by the kinds of counters. So if the card draw ability resolves and he has 5 +1/+1 counters on him, then that's 5 cards extra that you would draw, not taking into account the other ability counters that he may have. Okay, so now let's focus on that replacement effect that he has that gives him these abilities. I'm going to cover one bummer with that ability, but then also tell you about the secret counters that you can get for him. So let's start with the bummer. The wording on the dino is very specific. It says, it enters with a flying counter on it if a card discarded this way has flying. And it doesn't say for each card discarded. It just says if a card discarded. So this means that if you were to discard both an Argothian swine and an arrogant worm, then your dino would not enter with 2 trample counters on it, but just the 1 trample counter. All right, so now let's get to those hidden counters, or the secret counters, or however you want to describe them. You can play your dino, and then when you discard a Slippery Boggle to it, it will get a Hexproof counter. That's pretty plain and simple, nothing complex there yet. But what happens if you discard a Garruk's Harbinger that doesn't have Hexproof, but instead it has Hexproof from black? Will your dino get a Hexproof counter or just no counter because it doesn't have Hexproof? So the really cool thing about this is the answer is neither of those 2 answers that I just said. Your dino will actually get a Hexproof from black counter. Now, early in the video, I mentioned how discarding 2 creatures with Trample would not net you 2 Trample counters. But what would happen if you discard Garruk's Harbinger and also that Slippery Boggle that does have Hexproof? Will your dino enter with a Hexproof counter as well as a Hexproof from black counter? The cool thing is that it will enter with both counters, which of course, when it comes down to the actual impact that those have with Hexproof in terms of its gameplay, it is redundant for the most part, but the dino does come in with 2 counters, which means you'll draw more cards from its ETB trigger resolving. So feel free to discard a Knight of Malice that has Hexproof from white, alongside also discarding your Garruk's Harbinger so that you have 2 Hexproof from blank counters on it and you draw more cards. Now, we can see that the Comprehensive Rules has section 702.11f, which states that Hexproof from quality A and from quality B is shorthand for hexproof from quality A and hexproof from quality B. It behaves as two separate hexproof abilities. If an effect causes an object with such an ability to lose hexproof from quality A, for example, that object would still have hexproof from quality B. Sadly, I couldn't find an effect like cephalid snitches that applies to a specific form of hexproof. Cephalid snitch has just a very specific ability, making it one of the most useless creatures in all of Magic. Giving protection from, or removing protection from black. But we do have cards in Magic that remove the standard version of Hexproof, like the very popular Shadow Spear. So bonus question number 1. If your opponent activated the Shadow Spear to remove Hexproof from your creatures, and you had discarded a Garruk's Harbinger to your dino, would the Shadow Spear remove the Hexproof from black because of it having a Hexproof from black counter on it? Bonus question number 2. You play your dino, and you discard a Nevinyrral Urberg Tyrant. Will your dino have a single hexproof counter that gives hexproof from artifacts, creatures, and enchantments? Or would your dino enter with 3 individual hexproof counters for each of those respective qualities? And yes, I know that Nevinyrral is not in the color identity of the dino, but who knows? Maybe you're playing a 4 or a 5 color deck that has both of these creatures in the 99. Bonus question number 3. You discard your Archetype of Endurance as you play your dino, and it says that creatures you control have hexproof, not other creatures you control, so when in play, it would itself have hexproof. Will this cause your dino to enter with a hexproof counter? And finally, before closing out of this episode, bonus question number 4. Let's take a look at Thrasta Tempest's Roar, which has Trample, Haste, and also it has Trample over Planeswalkers, and finally it says that it has hexproof as long as it entered the battlefield this turn. How many and what kinds of counters would your dino have if you discard this Thrastra dino? As always, I will be responding to this bonus question as well as the other bonus questions, and I'll include a very specific comprehensive rules reference for this number 4 bonus question to help you figure out the answer if you're unsure. I won't provide these answers when the video first goes up, but I will be responding to some of the comments, and if nobody figures this one out, then again, I will just include that comprehensive rules reference. Anyhow, that's all I've got for today's episode. As always, I hope that all of you have found this video to be entertaining at least, and I hope that a few of you have even learned something about the crazy rules in this great game of Magic. Have a good one. Ta-ta!